As someone who's older than Splash Mountain, I can remember sitting with my step-grandfather and routinely watching Song of the South as a tiny kid. And I can even recall being in a second grade music class where they brought out a Disney sing-along VHS tape and it had Zippity Doo-Dah on it. From my young perspective, it was like any other Disney film. But by the time I was a teenager who went around buying up Disney DVDs, I noticed that Song of the South never came out. And that always seemed weird to me when older titles like That Darn Cat and Follow Me Boys eventually hit shelves. Then all of the controversy about Song of the South started to become known to me, and it landed so weird. Like, really? Really? See, in my head, it was a movie where a smart rabbit keeps tricking a dumb fox and bear, and any indication that the characters were ethnic went right over my head at age 3. I mean, to be fair, I always thought Uncle Remus was actually everyone's biological uncle too, so, when you're a kid, you don't really get it. And after years of patiently waiting, I finally found someone online who was selling bootleg copies of Song of the South, and I thought, yeah, let's give it a try. So I rewatched it, and yeah, it's not at all how I remembered it. But let's take some time and talk about this movie and discuss whether or not it should be buried and forgotten. Hey guys, I'm Megan. This is the Fangirl, and I am fully admitting up front that everything I'm about to say is from the perspective of a white girl, and I can only understand and experience this movie from that perspective, and as someone with a film degree. So there are going to be things that other people see here that I just don't get, because I don't have a way to fathom someone else's perspective. So let me preface this by saying, whether you love or hate this movie, what I have to say does not take away or diminish what you feel, and everybody has to make their own choices about what this movie means to them. Now, movies can be very straightforward, but you can also read hidden messages against the grain of the film, and I believe that Disney used Song of the South not to glorify slavery, but to play Inception and to put the seeds of change into people's heads. So if Disney could convince people to come see a movie about the old days in the South, maybe those seeds would turn into blossoms in the minds of their children. Of course, I have no proof of this because by the mid-90s, Disney tried to pretend this movie never happened while also keeping Splash Mountain around, which is curious. But the point is, Disney won't openly talk about this movie, which I think is a mistake. And while there are negative things in the film, there are so many people out there already talking about those points that I'm probably going to end up talking about the less mentioned elements of the movie. Now, if you haven't seen Song of the South before, because it is very hard to get a hold of, it's about a journalist man essentially dumping his wife and kid at his mother's doorstep before he takes off to go write or something. The movie never actually clarifies the dad's urgency to leave, and the son, Johnny, is so upset by his father piecing out that he decides to run away, and Uncle Remus asks to join him. Uncle Remus has a personal cabin on the property that is pretty worn down, and if you don't know what you're seeing, like I did not as a kid, you just kind of think he's poor. However, he is definitely meant to be a remnant of slavery. Then Uncle Remus tells Johnny a story about Brer Rabbit, and that kind of calms Johnny down and he goes home. And through the rest of the movie, Johnny comes to Remus constantly, and Remus has all sorts of stories that are riddled with advice to help the kids with their problems. Then we have a side story where Johnny meets a poor girl named Jenny, and Jenny gives Johnny a dog that her brothers want to drown because they're little treasures like that. And that builds up a bunch of tension between Johnny's mom and Remus until she tells him to keep his stories away from her son. But Remus not only fills in the gap of a father figure that Johnny desperately needs, but he's also making Johnny very accepting of people of color and people of different financial stations, which his mother is also not too happy about, as she doesn't want the poor girl Jenny at Johnny's Johnny's birthday party. So when Mama gets mad at Remus, he is so upset that he packs up and leaves, saying this is the only home he's ever known, but he's going to Atlanta now. It is a little abrupt and takes things a bit too far over one stern confrontation with the mother, but I think the movie has Remus leave to highlight that Uncle Remus is free, and so no one is going to stop him or harm him for choosing to leave, which again would be another reason why this movie is very confusing to young audiences. And Johnny is so hurt when he finds out. He's broken over Uncle Remus leaving, and he ends up getting himself gorged by a bull as he tries to chase down Remus's carriage, because, you know, Remus is the only adult that will spend any time with that kid. And even when Johnny's father reappears, out of it Johnny is crying out for Uncle Remus, not Papa. Then the movie ends with Remus deciding to stay, and the kids, both black and white, rich and poor, are playing together with all of Remus's characters while they sing Zippity-Doo-Dah, which means the final note the movie ends on is showing the extreme influence that Uncle Remus has on making the next generation's life joyful. So while the film does have some very problematic areas, it also has some incredibly sweet moments too. And so it makes me feel very torn on how to feel about this movie being hidden, because I see both sides of it. It's also important to note that the production of this movie was rough. Modern Mouse actually did a really good video going over the history and issues with that, and while it really is awkward that the movie doesn't take any stances against slavery, the film is also presented in a way that slavery is never mentioned. So if you don't already know that part of American history, you probably have no idea that that's an element that's going on just below the surface of this film. So adults are going to see this movie a lot differently than children. Now, Song of the South is not a Walt Disney brainchild. It's actually based on a book series called The Tales of Uncle Remus. The stories from this book were written between 1880 and 1905, so obviously it's going to be weird to go back and look at something from, you know, when the Civil War had recently ended. So yeah, there's stuff you look back on and cringe over, sort of like how I cringe when I watch an 80s show and hear how they casually demean the female characters. Sometimes you have to stop yourself, step back, and see the full context of what the world was when something was created. So, do the Uncle Remus stories feel racially charged today? Certainly, especially when you realize that the author, Joel Chandler Harris, basically looked like a Roosevelt. He's the whitest white guy to ever white, so probably not the best person to be telling these stories in hindsight. But the world was what it was back then. Black authors weren't getting readily published, and white people writing those types of stories wasn't an issue at the time. So we can't really go back and blame the book for outlasting its zeitgeist. But we also have the same kind of issue with Disney making Song of the South, because arguably no one would remember the books if not for the movie. And yeah, it's easy to look at it in the 2000s era and see it as a problem that should have never been made, but this movie was made in 1946 when Jim Crow laws were still very much alive and well. So it is a much more convoluted issue than a simple Walt should have known better. It was literally a different world when Song of the South was greenlit, and in most theaters, people of color couldn't even go to the movie theaters. And if they could, there was what was called a colored section, which is exactly what you think it is. But for as out of date as Song of the South has become, I don't get the sense that it was made with the intention of negatively portraying people of color. In fact, I see Disney mostly attempting to do the opposite when I rewatch the movie as an adult. People have called Song of the South a love letter to slavery and romanticizing Jim Crow, and you can certainly draw that conclusion 100%. And it's really made worse by the voices used for Brer Rabbit, Brer Fox, and Brer Bear, because they are all black voice actors speaking in a way that comes off as uneducated and derogatory. I think the movie would play a lot differently if white voice actors were in there too. But again, it is what it is now. It's a finished product. However, I do also want to recognize that these stories are being told by Uncle Remus as the animations pop up. And Remus voices the fox and the rabbit, which makes sense because he's the narrator. But Remus is doing the thing that a lot of dads and uncles and storytellers do, where they get into their stories and have different voices and temperaments for their characters. And that is a big plot device being used in the movie. But then we have Brer Bear, who was voiced by a different black actor. So it's not like other choices couldn't have been made, they just didn't make them. Honestly, the voices being used were probably not an issue that Disney considered at the time. In fact, they likely saw it as a big positive deal that all the animated characters were voiced by black actors. Realistically, that is probably the first time that had ever happened, which does make it extra unfortunate that Disney wasn't more careful and tasteful with how those characters come across. Yet, despite the iffy choices in the film, here we have Disney releasing a major movie in a time filled with racial tension and suffering and discrimination, and then here we have black and white kids playing together in the 1940s without a word of their skin tone being mentioned. Plus, here is Uncle Remus, the star of the movie, and a man who is such a community leader that he's all but worshipped by Johnny, the rich white boy. And Remus is very fondly remembered by Johnny's father, the rich white journalist. Even Johnny's mother consults Remus over what white children are telling her. So, looking at this from the lens of the 1940s, Remus is a very well-respected man who is portrayed in a much higher level of importance than almost any other black character I've seen in any movie made before the 1960s. That might not sound like much, but that's kind of a gigantic deal when your entire audience after World War II is solely white Americans. So yes, watching this movie now, I can see that Disney failed to make a direct anti-slavery stance, and they also declined to show any difficult aspects of being African American. However, if actions speak louder than words, then we can't just ignore Uncle Remus being the star character of a 1946 movie when dark-skinned people were barely allowed to exist in film back then. Let's also not forget that the actor who played Remus, James Baskett, was the first black man to receive an honorary Academy Award, the first man of color to get an Oscar. And it was only an honorary award because, due to his race, he couldn't be considered a serious, real contender in the 1940s. But oh my goodness, to break through and win over all those thick-headed people and be acknowledged at all is such a huge achievement. He broke through the glass ceiling. And I do have to point out that in Song of the South, the black characters are definitely poor compared to the plantation owners. You can easily see that the people of color aren't as well dressed and they have very different living conditions. So I can see the complaint that this movie makes that era seem a lot more joyful and happy than it truly was for the people of color living through that situation. And all of the black characters speak in a more informal, almost uneducated type of way that comes off very whoa now buddy in the 2020s. However, I also think it's fair to point out that Jenny, the white girl who lives down the road, and her entire family are in rundown clothes and frowned upon by the Richards as well. Jenny's broke family also uses the same kind of improper grammar that the African American characters use. So I truly think that Disney saw the language as a class issue and not a skin color specific association. And again, I easily see what people mean when they try to bring that issue up. There are definitely a lot of parts of that movie that have not aged well, but I also don't think that those in charge ever thought of it that way. This entire movie seems to really care about Uncle Remus and see him as the best of humanity, even if that communication has become muddled spoiled over the years due to how they shape the character overall. And like many movies, there are a lot of ways that you can read into it. But if you watch the story unfold, it's basically about white people being too stupid and helpless to function without black people taking care of them. I mean, come on, Johnny is upset for like 10 seconds and ends up being run down by a bull, despite the lengthy warning given to him by Toby, a young boy of color. Also, what brought Johnny out of his coma-like state? Well, it was the presence of Uncle Remus and the songs of the people gathered outside his window. Come on, Johnny's own father came from out of town before a flipping doctor was called in to check on this injured child. These white people are dumb as rocks in this movie. Overall, though, even weighing out the positives and negatives in this film, it was not easy to make a successful movie with people of color in it, especially if there was any hint of equality in that film. So the positive messages had to be a lot less obvious. Kind of like how when Sailor Moon came over to the United States in the 90s and they made the two lesbian characters into cousins that just like to hug and kiss a lot. You have to make content that your audience, your community is willing to consume. And I think with Song of the South, Disney did the best that they knew how with the world that they lived in at that time. And it does not strike me as a movie that is meant to have any negative connotations to it. It's certainly an insensitive movie, and it glosses over many, many issues about the social hierarchy of that time, but what Disney movie really does tackle those kind of hard topics? They all wave that magic wand and only give us the best parts of the bad situations. And Uncle Remus comes off to me as someone who's accepted the hand they were dealt in life and they're making the best of it. Does that make slavery okay? No! Were there real people in history who did what Uncle Remus did? Yes. So it's a tough spot where every complaint and compliment about the movie can both be right. Song of the South definitely wouldn't be made today, and I doubt that Disney will ever let the movie see the light of day again in the United States. But if you haven't seen it, it's worth tracking down and deciding for yourself how you feel about it if you're comfortable doing that. I see the bad things in the movie, I see the good things in the movie, but I'm really glad to finally have a copy of my own that I'm able to process for myself. It's very easy today for someone to tell you, no, that's bad, and you just run with it without really digesting what they're saying is bad. And I really think that hiding Song of the South in the United States is not the best way to handle the fact that this movie exists, and there is, at least at this moment in time, a giant ride in Disney World and Disneyland themed for this film, and that ride was built in the 90s, so again, really weird choices, Disney. Anyways, if you have seen this film, I would love to get your civilized opinions of it in the comments below, so let me know what you think. I might be overthinking it, but that's literally my job. Well, family members, we're almost done, but I want to invite you to hang out with me in some other places. I'm on Twitter and Instagram as my own personal self, and I have a Facebook page too, but I mostly just post photos over there. And sometimes people say, hey McGann, I want to mail you something. How do I do that? Easy. Just click the About tab on my channel page, and my most current P.O. Box info will be right there. I also run another channel, The Family. It's really a hodgepodge channel where we might post anything. Oh yeah, and I also sell shirts and stickers and stuff with the Family and the Fangirl logos. If that is your cup of tea, I have a link in every description of every video. Finally, if you want to help out the Fangirl channel and make sure I'm putting out video essays for years to come, the best way you can help is by subscribing and watching more of my videos, whether they're new, old, whatever. Maybe even share one or two on social media, help spread the word. People who watch to the end of videos like you helps to tell the site, hey, this is a good video, we should recommend it to other people. So if you made it this far, leave me a comment of something like, hey, I made it to the end. Love ya. See you next time, family members.